I was born in Anaheim, California. I was one of 4 daughters, number 3, to my parents. My father worked as, both my parents are from Michigan. My mother was raised in Millington on a small family farm. We still have the farmhouse in our family today. But it was a really hard life. It didn't make a lot of money. They were poor. So they had a lot of foster kids. So there were just a lot of people in the house and not a lot of space. And my mother was the oldest, and so she was responsible for a whole lot. And I think she felt that she had disappointed her father in not being born a boy. And my father was born and raised on the streets of Detroit. So he was in the city, but he was born to parents that were not, well, he had a violent alcoholic father who left the family at a pretty early age, and my grandmother needed to go to work. She worked in a factory, and so at a very young age, my father grew up on the streets of Detroit because back then there was no childcare. The streets of Detroit would be his childcare. So both my parents had very difficult upbringings, childhoods, and they were both really traumatized. And what I know about trauma now is that, you, as a child, you're born, we're all born these beautiful open beings, right? And absolutely sure that our needs are going to be met, which is why we cry. But what happens is, if we are traumatized and we have these children, we're not able to meet their needs, and we pass this trauma down. And this trauma is told in stories, but it's also, I think more important, it's the behavior that's modeled, that all the children pick up on. And right around the age of 6 or 7, we all just sort of pick up that story and make it our own. And I think that's really how trauma gets passed down. Our parents get sold on a story that never belonged to them. It damages them in ways. They grow up with it. They add their own trauma to it. They don't know that there's another story out there, better story for them. They have one story to tell us, and that's how it gets passed down. And I think, and then of course, I got raised in all that trauma that they didn't want to pass down to me, that couldn't help. And I picked it up around 7, and I made it my own. And a lot of the things that happened to me along the way just added to more of that trauma. I developed different coping mechanisms. I remember at the age of 3, my mother took the 4 of us, and we were 4 little girls, 8 years old and down, on a train across country. I don't know, she was crazy, to a family reunion. And I was 3 years old, turning 4. And I remember something traumatizing happened to me with one of the men from my family reunion. And I had all these big feelings and didn't know what to do with them. So on the train ride home, I remember really grappling with what happened? What does it mean? Why do I have all these feelings I'm too young to deal with? And I remember being very aware that this was sort of beyond my pay grade, more than I was ready to handle. And just the soothing nature of the train, right? And realizing that I had an opportunity to kind of distance myself from all of it. I didn't know what to do with all of it, so I just sort of imagined that I was in a big boxcar, and I put all of that in the boxcar behind me, right? Because, that's what I do, is I avoid and try to get out of things. So I just thought, I'll just put it in the boxcar behind me, and I'll just pull the pin, and I'll watch the boxcar go away. And as I speed along, I won't feel that. And it worked. And it worked at that young age. And that became my biggest coping mechanism that I still do today. I just check out. And I don't even have to go through all that anymore. I just imagine in the big fields of whatever's going on, I just imagine a little, I'll just dump it here and pull the pin and boom, it's gone, right? On to the next. And what I didn't realize is that it really doesn't go away. It gets buried deep down in the subconscious. And it's like a beach ball that just always wants to come back up again. And you gotta like push it down, push it down, push it down, and it creates a lot, you use up a lot of energy that way in doing that. And my family's dysfunction, let's get back to that, it affected us all in different ways, but what we all struggle with is self-worth, in our ability to allow love in, our ability to see anything good in ourselves. That, my mother, because of the way she was raised on the farm, they had to work very hard. So that worth was tied to the amount of work that she could get done in a day. And if she could get done a whole lot of work in a day, then she, in her words, earned her right to be here. And that is, it's an all too familiar feeling for me, that I have to work my ass off just to feel okay about who I am. And if I'm not giving everything away, I feel like in some way I'm being very selfish. And it's just a very self-destructive place to live all the time. And it's an easy one to get exploited in if your worth is tied to how much you can give and you have no boundaries. There's always somebody ready to exploit that. And anyway, we all sort of grew up with that. And I had an older sister who should have been medicated for hyperactivity, ADHD. And she was sort of a bully of the house. And the whole family she became the hub around which the whole family sort of moved. And so that kind of added to shaping me and my sisters. Now today, it took me a long time. It took me until my 50s to really forgive her and move on and have a good relationship with her. But I did. It's possible. So my mother, with her particular trauma, she was abused growing up. She got into an abusive first marriage and got out of that. And there was some pretty terrible things that had happened in that marriage before meeting my father. And their first date was confrontation between my mother's ex-husband and my dad. And they got into it. And that sort of solidified my mother and father's relationship on that very first date. It's like my dad had that desire to kind of show up and rescue, I think. And my mom definitely needed rescuing. But my mother never took the steps to work through her own anxiety. And instead of facing it herself, she became extremely fearful and began reaching outside herself to control the world around her, to make herself feel better. And that included all of us and my father and everything she did. And she was this big giver. So she showed up in all these big ways for people around her. And she did show up in ways for us, but she did give it all away to the people outside the family. And we got a little different bit of that wasn't so pleasant. We got like the resentment that forms when you give stuff away that you don't know how to fill yourself up with again. And when you give it all away, people are expecting you to continue to give and have the ability to show up for them that way. And they don't understand why you can't do that anymore. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, wait a minute. And that's where resentment really comes in. And so we got to see a lot of that side of it. So growing up under that, when you are micromanaged to that degree, you don't develop the ability to think for yourself. And so I grew up not thinking for myself, and the few times I did, sort of being berated for it and punished for it. So I stopped thinking for myself, and I just waited to be told what to do, as did a few of my other siblings. So when I got into the older years, I realized that I was far too emotionally connected to my mom. My mom's, people are complicated. They have these wonderful sides to them, and she's this beautiful, wonderful being, but she's super scared, she's super fearful, and that fear comes out in every exchange, every time she verbalizes anything. It's all about being safe. Don't take any chances. This could happen. The sky is falling kind of thing. And you grow up with that. That is your mindset. That's how you see the world. You become very fearful of going out and doing anything in the world. And so I kind of was set up not for success in that, my father, who is an alcoholic with a low opinion of women, getting that side of it, and then my mother's side of it, your place in the world isn't a bright, sunny place with a lot of opportunity or future prospects. It's just sort of dark and negative, and it was a hard story to try to build a life on. And I went out into the world a little bit early. My first job was at age 10. I knew that the key to me being independent was going to I was going to need to make some money. So my very first job was at a little grocery store not far from where we lived. And I collected, if you can believe this, at age 10, I collected carts in a very busy grocery store parking lot by myself, and cleaned the front area and around in the back alley, and would help people with their groceries and get a little tip every once in a while, and I'd get a little money for that. I can't imagine a 10-year-old doing that today. That would be something. But I felt, it was the first time I really felt like, a little power in my life. This is a little power that I had. And so, when we moved, then I stopped working. We moved when I was in 7th grade, and that was the first time that my mother left the house, so she was not home with us anymore. And she went to work quite a lot. My dad was gone. We were older. We were now teenagers, and it was not fun for anybody at the house. And so my dad was like, yeah, I'm not showing up unless I've got to, because it was a lot of fighting. And that period of time, our family sort of fell apart when my mom left the home and started working, because my younger sister and I were too young for that, really, and we really needed her. And we weren't prepared. We had no idea how to take care of ourselves or what to do, because we were raised not thinking for ourselves. So we went our separate ways, and I remember that was a very lonely, isolating time for me. And that's when I really started getting depressed and having my very first suicidal thoughts. I didn't realize, I know now, I didn't realize then that I had deep depression, like clinical depression, that had to be medicated. And I didn't realize, I thought it was just sad. I was sad, and I didn't realize that it was really rage, unexpressed rage, that I had just swallowed down my whole life, and had that really great coping mechanism, putting it in the boxcar behind me, came back to bite me on the ass, because I didn't put it anywhere other than deep down inside. And I held it in my heart. I hardened my heart, because I was super sensitive. I remember just feeling like one giant raw nerve, being so sensitive to everything around me, and crying a lot and not being able to control my emotions. And the only thing I could do, because I got teased so much for it, was like a hand wringer too, A lot of people made fun of me for wringing my hands, because I was so worried about things, and I was really tied into my mom's emotional responses, which were always really kind of big, heightened emotional responses. And I just remember feeling like, it's hard to explain, just so exposed though, so raw. It's just so unprotected. Didn't feel protected at all. And I clamped it all down, man. And that's how I learned to deal with it. And I hardened my heart. And by the time I was in high school, my family home life was even more difficult. I don't know if I can say it was a real shit show, but it was a real shit show at the house. Everybody was fighting, nobody was loving, and everybody was pretty miserable. And I started in with an eating disorder that went out of control. What I know now about eating disorders is it happens when you feel out of control, and it's a way of trying to bring control back into your life. I went into self-harming, deep depression, isolation, but I could work. Wasn't a great student by that time. Wasn't a bad student, but wasn't a great student at that time. And I was struggling with ADD myself. And I began to smoke pot and drink. You know, alcohol was around our house from an early age, and drinking was acceptable in our household, and it wasn't something, that was taboo. And my mom and dad drank, and they had parties, and I remember being at events where there was just a lot of booze everywhere. And we'd even have little shot glasses, and we were allowed 3 shot glasses of whatever, during the evening. And of course, as soon as you find out it makes you a little dizzy, you want more and more of that. And they tasted like candy. It was like a pina colada or something. So it's just like, oh, this is yummy. And 3 shots of this is just not nearly enough at 6 years old. So I'm just going to have to dive right in. And I remember being about 6 when I realized, when I got that there was a connection between what I was drinking and how I was feeling, and that what I was drinking and how I was feeling was helping how I felt day to day and making that connection. And so when I was a teenager, going ahead and drinking on a regular basis wasn't a big step. And dating became tricky, and I was really shut down. I was scared of men and boys, and I was told by my father that all they wanted was sex, and that's pretty much what we were there for, and not to trust anybody. And I didn't trust a lot of people, and I was incredibly shy. And I had developed skills to overcome the shyness, which made it easier for me to make friends and move in the world. But when it came down to opening myself up and making myself vulnerable, that was still pretty shut down and wasn't able to do it. I had also had experiences with my first boyfriend. I was 17 and he was 21. And that was my first sexual experience and my first experience with domestic violence. It was my first, he was 21, I was 17, and the first time he hit me was when we were having an argument driving down the road at 60 miles an hour. And he, out of the blue, and we were yelling at each other, driving down the road. Out of the blue, he just came, boom, hit me on the side of the head, and my head went into the window. And it stunned me. And I kept seeing him. I kept seeing him. Because by that time, all my boundaries had been broken, down. There was no instruction on how to draw firm boundaries. I had witnessed my mother's inability to draw any boundaries or stand up for herself, and how difficult it was for her to find her voice. And it did not give me permission. It gave me permission to sort of think that this was what I deserved, what I was worth. And that's the real rub, is that you buy into that story, right? All the potential in the world is not going to remove that deep, dark feeling that, if anyone really saw you, they'd see how terrible you were. Totally not lovable. No way you're close to nearly enough, just as you are. So it's a hard one. It's a hard one to get over, especially if that's the only story you're told. So this started sort of kind of an ongoing struggle with domestic violence. Well, I won't say domestic violence, but just abuse, because it was mostly mental, physical, emotional abuse, just, being cruel that way. But there was physical abuse in my first marriage. And he was such a great guy. He was so nice. He was such a great guy. And he had become my best friend. We only knew each other 3 months when we got married, but I was crazy about him. And I went into it, getting a little ahead of myself. After high school, I broke up with this first boyfriend. He wouldn't leave me alone, eating disorders out of control. I don't have any plans to go on to college. I'm kind of in a dead-end job, so I decided to go into the military. One was because I knew I needed some external, very rigid rules in place because I was completely undisciplined. I knew that I needed to learn how to discipline myself, and that the eating disorder was so out of control that I needed a place to go to. In hospital treatment was not an option, and this was sort of the next best thing. I would be forced to be away from access to food and only have access to it during meal times, and I needed the structure as well. So I went in, and it worked. It actually was the thing that kind of started turning all of that around. I was forced to discipline myself, and in disciplining myself, that void began to fill up within me. When you don't do well in the world, you feel terrible about yourself. When you're not doing well in the world and you've got all this potential, you could be doing better, and you're not, and you don't know how to undo or learn to teach yourself, then it is, it can be a real struggle. It can be a real struggle. Okay. So in the military, right out of boot camp, feeling great, looking awesome, I meet my daughter's father, and we hit it off. And what I don't realize, I think I've met my soulmate. Man, we're just like this, right? And what I don't realize is that could be a red flag where you are hitting, when you are so dysfunctional, when your dysfunction is so great that it's ruling your life, that what you will draw to you is somebody that matches that dysfunction. And when it feels so natural, that means their dysfunction is fitting yours just like a glove. And then we just went on our dysfunctional way. And I didn't realize when I met him, he had already been in so much trouble with the law that he was in the military because it was either military or jail. And it didn't take long from when we got married. 6 weeks later, I was pregnant. And 5 months into the pregnancy was the first sign of trouble, where he had addiction issues. And that was my first taste of many relationships to come of addiction issues. And it does seem that addictive personality is what I draw in, probably because I have an addictive personality as well. But whatever it is, I draw it in, matches my dysfunction, and there we go. So by the time she was born, it was clear to me that he was way down the rabbit hole with drugs and drink and alcohol and just not showing up. And so when he went on his Westpac tour, I went to live with my family. And when he came back, we parted ways, and he moved up to Oregon with his family. And I have to say, over the years, right in the beginning, I was wondering if I was making the right choice. But as his life unfolded, I realize today that that was the best choice I could have made for my daughter and I, is just to leave at that point, not to get drugged down that road, that real painful road he went down. And then I was a single mom with all this dysfunction, and one story to pass down to my daughter. Oh, and I passed that story on down to my daughter. And my daughter became fearful, and the same dysfunction started going again. And I set a great example of one relationship after the next of men who did not treat me well, difficult men who would exploit me, men who would not love me for me, but would see me as a way forward for them in some way. My resources, and not just money, but like all of my resources. The fact that I was so willing to give, that is one of my biggest resources. I didn't know how to fill myself up, and I had the example of giving it all away till you can't give anymore, and as soon as somebody wants more, getting really resentful. And I passed that on down to my daughter, man, that's the way it works. I've had issues with alcohol myself. When you grow up with it and you see your family cope and deal with their difficulties that way, it becomes kind of a no-brainer. And you think for a while, well, it works, until your relationships become problematic. And yeah, that really did impact a lot of my relationships, primarily because I would use it. I'm sitting here, right? I don't look like I'm a shy person at all. I'm very outgoing. I can handle myself in many situations, but when it comes to really opening up to someone, I am still so shy. And I couldn't get there sober. I just couldn't. And I had to use alcohol or marijuana or something to get myself where I could relax enough to make myself open and vulnerable. That doesn't work with healthy men. Surprise, surprise. That only works with dysfunctional men, and pretty soon in every relationship I had, it became very obvious to them that alcohol was going to be needed if they were going to be dancing light fantastic with me. And so, yeah, I used alcohol a lot as a tool to get through those difficult times. And so I was able to raise my daughter on my own. I became a 911 operator. And I did that for about 3 years, and was pretty good at it. But I decided to go back to college because I knew it was a dead end and I wanted more. So I went back to college when my daughter was 8, went through the university in 3 years, and ended up husband number 2 along the way. We were married. I was married to him 6 months when I was walking out of a salon. It was not an easy relationship. He was not a supportive person. I was exiting a salon on a Friday night, and I took a step and a half out onto the sidewalk, and I got mowed down by a man. How tall are you, Mark?
6'4".
Okay. He was an inch taller than you, a little stockier, on a big mountain bike, going as fast as he could on the bike. And he hit me. We flew through the air. We hit heads. I lost part of the peripheral vision in this eye. Got concussed. Flipped over. He and the weight of the bike came down on my hip. I ended up separating my SI joint, compressing my L5, multiple pelvic fractures around, completely displaced my pelvis, the alignment of my pelvis. Hospital trip. No surgery. Fortunately, there was a break, but it was in place enough that they thought that the surgery would actually make it worse. So they sent me home. I was in traction, and I couldn't see out of this eye for months. Constant migraines. And there I was, having newly been married, not supportive husband. He really needed a business partner. I went to school to become an artist. That's not a business partner. That's a creative partner. So he was already not pleased with me and the direction my life was heading. So it didn't take long after that for us to get divorced. That began the whole trip down the road with the prescription pain medication and alcohol, because the pain medication was just not enough. It was just not cutting it. And a very difficult time. I had to learn to walk again. It was tough. And it was difficult for my daughter. She was 13 at the time. It turned her into my caretaker, robbed her of her childhood. She ended up, the marriage was falling apart. It was really terrible. She ended up packing all of her stuff up and moving at 16, just deciding to move up to Portland with her father, who by that time was a heroin addict. And the chaos in the family was just too great for her, and she left. Our marriage fell apart. I ended up moving back to Bakersfield, where I continued on my journey. What I didn't say is, when I was in the military, my job was that I worked on jets. I worked on A4s and A4Js. I loved that. I love working on the flight line. But during that period of time, part of my duties was refueling, and I was training somebody, and we had an accident, and I got sprayed with jet fuel. And it was a massive massive and prolonged exposure. And it set in motion an autoimmune response that in 2 years I had a goiter on my neck, had Graves' disease, had to have my thyroid removed. By the time my daughter was 2, I had endometriosis, another autoimmune disease. It just progressed. So by the time I got hit, I had already had maybe half a dozen autoimmune disease diagnoses, and the hit created so much stress in my body that it sort of supercharged all of that. And so then it was really big ones like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, and the really, really big autoimmune diseases. So I went down the whole road of medication and getting convinced that at one point I'll get better. Western medicine is really great about putting you back together when you're broken, really good about symptom management, really good about, if you're almost dead, they can keep you going for a while. But curative stuff, there's still kind of not enough money to be made, I guess, in curing people. A lot of money to be made getting people on the symptom management, which is, I went down that road, and I finally realized in 2016, or a little later, that I was just getting worse. Just more medication and just getting worse. So in 2007, I was married for another time, and again, not to a supportive man, but to a man who was trying to exploit my resources. And I was really in a bad situation. Like I knew that this level of stress was really going to impact me. And a few months later, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and not the early stage. And it was really aggressive. It was triple negative, incredibly aggressive. And they got me in for surgery right away. And by the time I was diagnosed just a couple of weeks to the surgery date, it had already blown up. So I had to have bilateral mastectomies, a year of chemo, lots of radiation, went through losing my hair and all of that. But I held on to my life and got out of that marriage half as wealthy, but whole still. And then I was on my own for a while. So I went through the cancer treatments in '07, went through breast reconstruction in 2014. I fell, rupturing one of the implants, had to go back in for surgery. And while I was in surgery, there was a mistake that was made, and I had to go back in for a second surgery. Second surgery, I internally bled and needed a transfusion, and within 2 weeks of that, I had a life-threatening infection that got me back into the hospital again. A local hospital did not want to treat me because I was a mistake from Cedars-Sinai. I had to fight like hell to get them to treat me and to ambulance me. I knew how sick I was, and I could feel my body shutting down. And I had to threaten them. I had to threaten the doctor. And they finally got me into an ambulance. And I'm so glad, because I actually did die on the way down. My heart stopped. And this part actually is pretty funny. I have one memory from this. I died, and I have a memory from this, both the near-death experience and an actual physical experience, waking up right after they gave me CPR and scaring the bejesus out of the doctor and the two paramedics, because I guess it must have been right when they broke my rib. They broke all of my ribs. And it must have been right then, because I just remember sitting bolt upright with a, ah! And they jumped back in fear. And I remember thinking, oh, that's kind of funny. And then passed out again. But during that near-death experience, I remember being in the tunnel. And it's just like you see in the movies. It's the most bizarre thing. And I remember thinking, wow, this is just like you see in the movies. And it's all dark. It's all this plasma moving around, all this bright colors moving around. And it's the very first time I'm out of this very painful body. And I'm zipping around. I'm like, oh my God, this feels amazing. I feel so free. I'm not in this painful body. And I remember zipping around that tunnel and going, whoo, and feeling love for the first time. That was the most amazing thing, was that it wasn't that I felt love, unconditional love, for the first time in my life. It was that I was made of it. It was that the energy that I was made of was that unconditional love energy. And I just remember kind of being in that space thinking, this is who I am. I remember now. I remember. This is who I really am. It's like we come into the world and we forget that we're these divine, beautiful, love-based beings. And I just was floating there in basking in that unconditional love energy. And I was not progressing down the tunnel, but the side of the tunnel opened up. And I looked out, the side of the tunnel opened up, and I looked out, and it was a landscape. I was looking at a landscape, and it was gorgeous. And I remember having this very deep connection with it. And I thought, at the time, oh, well, maybe that's my home. Maybe that's where we go to. Maybe it's opening up, and I'm supposed to go there. I don't know. But I noticed in looking at it that it was nighttime. As gorgeous a landscape as it was night. It was a full moon, so you could see everything. But then I started looking around, and there was no leaves on the trees. It was all dark, only moonlit, no leaves in the trees, no grass, no animals, no water in the river, no life. There was no life. It was like a template for a beautiful landscape, but no life in it. And then I heard this voice, and it wasn't like I heard it externally. It was a voice that did not come from me, but it was in me, that said, you have a beautiful life. Beautiful. But up until now, you've done nothing with it. So your work is to go back and do the work to fill up that landscape, to add life, to add richness, right? And it was true. I was 51, 52. And up until then, my life had been full of pain, illness, terrible tragedy, loss. And I had taken just a headlong dive into self-sabotage. I mean, I was really digging deep actively pulling in things to sabotage myself. And that's kind of the tricky thing of it. When you don't feel like you deserve any better, when your secret feeling really is, man, you deserve all the bad things. That's really what you deserve. You will work overtime to make sure that nothing good comes into your life. And I began to realize that that's how thoughts become things, right? That's how we really do create our own reality. It's like the thoughts that we think of, that everybody, not just certain people, everybody has more than 50,000 automatic negative thoughts based on that subconscious story, that trauma story that we're raised in. And it's our own mind just spitting out, you're not good enough, you can't do it, you'll never succeed, you're not lovable, you're not enough, whatever the story is, man, it's just constantly blah, 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 blah. And you're living that out because you hold that thought. You hold a thought long enough, it becomes a feeling, right? That feeling, you hold that long enough, it becomes a mood. That mood picks up momentum, becomes a temperament, right? You hold the temperament long enough, and you're going to be known for whatever it is. It's a personality trait now. It becomes part of who you are. And all it was at the beginning was that you didn't stop that story from getting momentum. And I could see in my life how my life was unfolding and how I was creating all of the misery in my own life and pain. And I got turned on to this book called The Power of Now, which it had been sitting on my bookshelf for 10 years, and I had yet to even crack it open. And I had gotten myself into therapy after this, and she suggested that I read it. And I had so much physical pain that I didn't know what to deal with. And, this physical pain thing would ramp up and I wouldn't know what to do. And I actually had done a few very desperate things in the past. And my daughter had taken me aside the second time that happened. And she's just like, look, you got to promise me you're just not going to go down this road again. You can't do this to me. There is too much you are needed here for. You cannot leave me alone with these crazy people, right? So I made her a promise that I wouldn't do that. And so when the pain started ramping up again, I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? And so I had to find a different way. And I started really researching how the body works and how I could get myself up and out of this and what was happening to my body. And it led me down this road to this therapist who told me to read this book, The Power of Now. And one of the first chapters, Eckhart Tolle talks about the pain body. And it's so interesting because it's a real thing. We all have a pain body. And I didn't realize that I had been living my life inside this pain body. He had a few suggestions, and I tried them. And within 20 minutes, now mind you, I'm 52 years old. I have been dealing with painful conditions practically my entire life. And within 20 minutes of just trying these very simple techniques, I had reduced my pain, my physical pain, noticeably by almost half. And that was just trying it once. And I thought, oh my God, this is incredible. And I went down the rabbit hole in it. I started researching everything I could about mindset and about how to begin working with your brain and your body. I got into yoga. I became a yoga instructor. I started researching how to deal with inflammation because that was the big issue. I finally figured out a natural way forward, which allowed me to come off all of the heavy-duty medications that I was on that was doing nothing but enriching the doctors and keeping their kids in private school. And boy, the day I stepped out of my rheumatologist's office and I said, I'm not coming back, that was I don't want to say they were bad doctors. They were typical doctors. They were good doctors, but they were typical doctors. They showed more care trying to get me back into the door and back on those medications than they ever did trying to figure out what was wrong with me. And it's not their fault. It's the way that the system is set up. And I represented $100,000 minimum walking out that door annually for them. And that's why they wanted me back. And when I realized that, I thought, God, there's got to be a better way. And I think I found a better way. And that was the last time. I have never been on those medications since, and that was back in 2017. Now, I'm not saying I cured myself. I'm saying I figured out how to keep it in check. And it's all about learning how to control the inflammation. And there are certainly natural ways that you can learn to control inflammation. And your headspace is a big one. That pain body, getting your mind right, is a big one. And that set me on a journey towards figuring things out and turning my life around and turning around the story, beginning to understand that, hold on now, yes, I was given this trauma story, but this doesn't have to be the end story for me. I can tell myself a better story. I can begin to build a life off a better story. And I got so excited about that. And I thought, well, gosh, out of all the stories that are out there, what would a story that served me and helped me create the life I wanted to help create, what would that story look like? And it looks like what I'm doing today, which oh my God, I'm just so relieved that I figured this out. I became a yoga instructor. I had a degree in fine art and I taught art for years, and I got aligned through the cancer center. My oncologist happened to own the cancer center, and his wife and son run the foundation, and I happened to get connected with them, and through their foundation, I began working with students. I began teaching again, and I created a program, and it's all about breath work and mindfulness and art therapy, and teaching them how to control their minds, and it's way more than that. It teaches them how to begin to emotionally regulate, because that was it for me, and that's where I got into trouble. Is that silent rage that I had suppressed, right, was not so silent, it turns out. And it got me into a lot of trouble, as it turns out. In fact, I was facing, for 3 days, felony charges for aggravated assault because I had hurt someone. My rage was that out of control. And I learned how, exactly what it was and what I needed to do for it and how to emotionally regulate myself. And I began working with people first at the end of their lives. I became a death doula, and I realized all the people right at the end of their life, they had, like, within 4 to 6 weeks of their death, they had this sort of like epiphany. And they were like, I thought my whole life, I thought there was something wrong with me. And turns out there's nothing wrong with me. And I wasted my whole life thinking that and limiting myself because I had that belief about myself. And I thought, well, after the last person said the same thing, I thought, well, there's got to be a better way. And that's when this opportunity came up with the foundation, and I began working with teenagers, incarcerated teenagers to be exact, and at the juvenile hall locally. And I created this program, and it's not easy, right? You're working with teenagers, so they're, on a good day, fun, and on a bad day, more fun, right? They give a lot of pushback. They challenge me a lot. And, they keep me honest. But we began to see the needle moving with them. And I began to talk to them about their stories. And sure enough, they all had a trauma story. They all had a story of, I am not enough. I am unlovable. I can't do anything right. They all had limiting beliefs. And that's what we work with now. It's like identifying what the emotion is, where it is in the body, where it's coming from. You don't have words, assign a color, a shape, trying to get the mind and the body to connect again so that you can begin to process out all of these emotions. Because holding these emotions in is how we get sick. Holding these emotions in is how we ruin our lives. It's how we ruin our relationships with other people, Learning to let go, learning to love ourselves, learning to see the divine in us, in ourselves and the world around us. And it starts by just believing that there might be a better story out there for you. There's definitely another story. It's up to you, really, if it's going to be a better story. And it's up to all of us. And you know, I used to have this thing inside of me that it was very hard to describe, because in one sense, it was like I was hollow. Like I had this huge void, an abyss. And it felt very much like in times of distress, like there was no bottom. Like I was just falling. And I had no understanding of what it was or how to fill myself up. And I think that's what, that sadness, that fear inside that we're truly not enough. I think that's where a lot of the addiction comes from, trying to fill that void, fill it up with anything. And if you can't fill it up, just medicate yourself so you don't have to deal with it. But what I learned was, in stepping into the center of my own life, because even in my 50s, I still hadn't owned my own life. I had bought into the story that I was raised with, that I was too weak, that I was too ill, I couldn't do anything for myself. I needed people around me to help me. And that robbed me. It really hobbled me in my life. And being able, not having to, but being able to turn that around and say, no, wait a minute. There's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm strong enough. I'm capable. I can do this. And making that my story, learning how to stand in the center of that story, actually was the very thing that filled that void up. And I think it has to do with learning to be brave, learning to be courageous, because we all have challenges, right? And so we come up and we bump up against those challenges. And if we have the right stuff, we can push through those challenges. And it's the very act of pushing through those challenges, of being afraid, not knowing you can do it, but just finding the gumption within you just to dig down deep and push through, that fills that void up. That's incredible, the way that happens. The reverse is true. You come up to that obstacle, and this was me, first 52 years of my life. I'd try a few things, try and fail. Well, sometimes I just go up and go, oh, that is just too big. I'm just not even going to try. And I'd convince myself that I didn't need to do it, or I'd be better off not doing it. And I would shrink away from the challenge. I wouldn't find my courage. I wouldn't find my feet beneath me. And sure enough, that void within me grew. That bottomless pit grew. That feeling of, I can't do anything right. Success is just not for me. Began, and that story started, right? And I realized, okay, I can work with this. I see how the void gets bigger, and I see how the void gets smaller. And so I leaned into how the void gets smaller, and it got smaller. And I have this, you know, you buy them at the little souvenir shops, and they're like either a giraffe or an Eiffel Tower, and you push the bottom of them and they crumple, and you let it go and they spring back up. Finding my feet underneath me had a real physical feel to it that felt very much like that. And the more I dug down deep, and the more I pushed into not perfection, but just progress, just moving every day, just doing my best to move the line forward, to get closer to whatever goal I wanted, to do what it is I really wanted to do in my life. That feeling made me physically feel like I could stand straighter, like I had a solid center to me now, just like letting go of that little thing and it pops right back up. Just a really strange way of talking about it, but it's kind of what it felt like physically. It's not over, right? It goes on and on. This is something you do every day, so it's not a one and done. And I have a lot of people say, okay, you've shown me these things. How long do I need to do these? And it's like, no. It's not how long do I need to do these and then go back to what I was doing. You become this, and that's what it is. That's what I realized. You have to become the change you want to see in your life. You have to become the person. It's not about taking a pill or showing up and signing this and doing that. You know, it's not about the individual act. It's about finding the line of energy within you that is really whatever it is you're wanting to become, and leaning into it and believing so much that you are capable of doing it that it becomes easy to do. And that was the other thing that I realized, is that the more I could convince my brain that I was capable of doing something, the easier my obstacles were to overcome. And the more I sat with thoughts of, I can't do it, the harder and more insurmountable my challenges became. So I just finished my first year, and I got a little surprised. I was really, I've just been kind of trying out this program, and I was very surprised to be nominated for the Outstanding Volunteer Services for my program. I was just awarded through Kern Probation a services award for the work that I do with them. So I think that it's having an effect. I know it's having an effect because I talk to the kids every day. And I don't know if it'll make a difference. I hope it does. At the very least, they now have a different story, and they now know that it's possible to create a different story for themselves. I guess it's up to them, just like it's up to all of us, whether we do it or not. You get up every day, you lean into it, you don't lean into it, and that's it. You lean into it, the hole goes away. You don't lean into it, the hole gets bigger. So that's my big lesson, I guess.
Wonderful. All right, Christine, thank you so much for sharing your story.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Mark.
I'm happy for you.
Thanks.